everyone. My name is Mariam Khalid. I'm the Director of Offensive Security here at Barracuda XDR. And just to give a little bit about my background, my team manages incident response. We are the frontline engineers that work with our teams, work with our customers when there is a breach and an incident within their environment. I also manage the detection engineering and the automation teams as well. So all of that, all of those aspects will kind of tie into the report. So before I get into the deep dive of the report, as Catherine mentioned, I would like to just do a poll just to get a gauge on where everyone is in the audience. So the first poll is, how familiar are you with XDR? If you just want to take a minute and answer that, and this way I know how um, how to present the details that I have.
Awesome. Just going to give a couple more moments for people to get their answers in. It should be popping up on your screen now. Really appreciate all of your answers here so we can get a better idea of where everyone is at. All right. Last chance for answers. All right, let's take a look at the results.
Awesome. So we have a mixture of audiences where it's a newer concept where they have worked with it and they know what it is, but they want to continue learning. So that's exactly why we're here, and we're going to get into the details of what XDR is. So just to give you a quick overview, Barracuda XDR is an open extended detection and response solution. So we integrate with over 40 different technologies, ranging from servers, cloud, firewalls, email protection, endpoint protection. The idea behind it is that you can bring your technology and we will monitor it and cover it to the best of our ability. It is managed and backed up by a security operations center, which is powered by security analysts, humans in the loop, and also powered by AI and automation. And our goal and our whole mission is to provide a holistic approach to managed service security. We want to detect and respond to incidents within as soon as possible, as soon as we see a high severity alert, we want to detect it within an hour. We want to provide that 24/7 holistic approach to security. And also, as I mentioned before, you want to integrate with your existing technology stack. And the shield that you see, it's very, very important. These are all the SKUs that we currently have, ranging from vulnerability security, email security, endpoint, network, server, and cloud. We actually just added our vulnerability security recently in the past few months, and I will be sharing the findings that we have within the report. But the shield is really, really important because what I want to emphasize is it's really important to monitor all the different aspects in your technology. Most importantly, if you want to think about it as a house, right? So you might have a door, you might have a window or a back door. If you're just protecting the front door, the threat actor can get in from a window or the back door. So essentially, the mission and the goal here is to protect all the entry points so threat actors are not able to get into your environment. So a little bit of how XDR works and the security event workflow. This is really important to understand. This will help you kind of digest the report a little bit more. So we start off with an event, right? Which is any single action that is conducted on a server or an endpoint, and we log that and we record it and we ingest that data. That data can either be ingested with an agent that we have, with an API connection if it is a cloud service, or we also support legacy forwarding methods such as syslog forwarding. Once we have that data, that is where the AI and the automation and a lot of our machine learning aspects come in within our fully managed SIEM. We also incorporate threat intelligence. So what that means is we have access to over 11 to 13 billion IOCs, and we are partnered with the most advanced threat intelligence platforms out there, including Anomaly and VirusTotal. So you are getting the latest threat intelligence feeds for your data. Once that data is analyzed, that's where the analysis part comes in. So we do a lot of cross correlation within your environment to see, hey, if there is a login happening, did we see any like brute force activity on your firewall? So vice versa, we have machine learning models as well that create baseline for your environment. So what may be normal for your environment may not be normal for someone else's environment. It's really important for us to differentiate that within machine learning, because what is authorized and normal for you may actually be malicious for someone else's environment. And then lastly, alert. This is where we notify our customers. We notify with a phone call, depending on the severity of the incident. For mediums and lows, it is an email alert. For highs, it is an email and a phone call within 20 minutes of the detection. We also do automated threat response. So this is the response capability within the XDR. And what that means is if we deem something that is high confidence, high confidently compromised within your environment before any communication with the customer or the client, we're actually going to go ahead and take that action. And this is something the customer can sign up for themselves. I will go over it towards the end of the PowerPoint on what are the different technologies that we support for XDR, ATR. So also closing it off, it is monitored and managed by a 24/7, 365 global operations center. So now that we have a handle on what XDR is, what we do, what's the benefits, and what are the key points that we want to provide to our customers and the mission that we're solving, I want to get into the report. But before I get into the report, let's talk a little bit about how this data was derived and how we derived this report. And the way we did it is we are actually getting this data directly from our customers. So our small to medium-sized businesses, we have thousands of customers within XDR. And in 2025, we actually logged over 2 trillion IT events. So as I mentioned before, this is just one single event, doesn't mean it's malicious, doesn't indicate any sort of security incident. It's just some activity happening in your environment. So that's logged over 2 trillion which is increasing from last year. And then derived from that, we issued about 600,000 security alerts. So these include lows and mediums, which were email alerts. And then derived from that, we had about 53 high severity alerts that were followed up by a phone call, a notification, and then we also took an action. So we either isolated a device on the network. We either blocked an IP address or we either suspended a user within your environment. And then also a really, really important stat that I wanted to share is we protected over 230,000 endpoints in 2025, which is almost double of what we did in 2024. So some of the key findings that I want to talk about from the report and that are really, really important and kind of lead to our next conversation is 100% of security incidents involved some sort of unprotected device. And this is really important because when I talk about a security incident in this aspect, this is a major breach within their environment. So either some sort of malware or some ransomware activity or some sort of business email compromise. 100% of those incidents, there was some sort of device on their network that was not monitored or protected. So again, going back to the shield that I showed in the beginning, how it's really important to protect all the different areas in your environment. So 96% of incidents, so 96% of the major incidents that we provided IR guidance for had some sort of lateral movement. So lateral movement is essentially almost a guarantee if the threat actor's main mission is ransomware. And then speaking of ransomware, the fastest ransomware attack that we saw from breach to encryption was about 3 hours, which is very, very fast compared to some of the legacy threat actors that we've seen where they'll go under the radar for about 2 weeks to a week. And then about 90% of ransomware incidents involved some sort of exploitation of a firewall. So essentially what that means is there was some sort of vulnerability or CVE within their firewall that caused the threat actor to exploit it and get into their network. So that's why it's very important to have a patch policy in place. And then 66% of incidents involved some sort of supply chain or third-party vendor. So very, very important whenever you're partnering with someone, whenever you're choosing a vendor, you work closely with your legal team and make sure that they have the best security practices. So I want to talk a little bit about the techniques that we saw. All of our detections are actually mapped to the MITRE framework. And what that means is, sorry, my internet is having some issues. So give me a minute. Okay, that should be better. So all of our detections are mapped to MITRE framework. And what that means is we make sure there's a tactic and technique involved with every incident. So either if it's privilege escalation or if it's some sort of exfiltration that's happening with your network, we map it with the alert that's being sent out. So the top technique that we saw within 2025 was actually privilege escalation. And what that means is threat actors are actually adding users to admin groups. So a user being added with high risk rights, or a user being removed with high risk rights, or even in your cloud practices, right? You can have a user in Microsoft 365 that's adding a user or removing a user. And then even in your on-prem devices, such as FortiGate firewalls, you can add a user or remove a user. So privilege escalation has been one of the top techniques that we saw in a lot of the incidents that we managed in 2025. So I do want to talk a little bit about an incident that we did in 2025, and this one actually involves privilege escalation, so it's a great example. The top of the timeline, you'll see the threat actor, and then the bottom of the timeline is where XDR actually intertwined and stepped in to stop the attack. So the first thing that happened, again, as I mentioned before, it was a rogue device, a vulnerable device. There was no XDR or any sort of protection installed on that device. The threat actor actually went ahead and exploited that vulnerability and added a admin account, which was then escalated to a super admin account. Once that happened, they actually went ahead and installed managed XDR, and threat actor actually went ahead and created some scheduled tasks, and we were able to detect that because they were running some suspicious tasks within their computer. And then an hour later, they were installing a bunch of fake users. Some admin users were moving laterally. They were deploying malicious Python scripts. XDR endpoint managed monitoring actually went ahead and isolated that and completely contained the incident. Once that happened, they actually went ahead and tried to execute some PowerShell scripts to talk to a command and control server. Again, that was blocked by XDR. They were not able to do it. And then they attempted to actually exfiltrate some small amount of data using a device that did not have any sort of XDR endpoint monitoring on it. We actually went ahead and saw that data with the network monitoring. We saw there was a high volume of data being exfiltrated from their network. And this was something that we detected. So again, what I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have all the entry points and all your different technologies managed and monitored, because threat actors will find another way to get in. So given that device that was doing the data exfiltration did not have the managed endpoint on it, we were still able to see see the activity with network monitoring. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the top attacks that we saw in 2025. The first attack that we saw was anomalous login within 365. So as you know, business email compromises, phishing emails are really the low-hanging fruit, and threat actors target that by social engineering, or even with AI, they can construct an email that looks very, very identical to the real thing. So the top detection was anomalous login. And what that means is if we see any sort of login that is out of the baseline. So for example, a user is using a different device, completely different device. They're using a completely different ISP. They are logging in from a location that they've never logged in before. So we have different features within our model that identify and predict anomalous login. And that was one of our top detections which was able to stop more large-scale attacks. And then the second top attack that we saw was Sentinel-1 threat mitigated. So this could be a file being executed. This could be a process being executed. This could be anything suspicious happening within your endpoint device. We actually are able to see the threat and mitigate it as soon as possible. So not going to go over all of them, but I think those two were the top attacks that we saw within our organizations. Really quickly, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the findings we had from managed vulnerability scanning. This is a new SKU that we introduced in the last few months, and some important metrics is that we actually found almost 4,000 critical vulnerabilities within the customer database of the customers that are signed up for managed vulnerability, and that's huge. That's basically a door wide open for a threat actor to come in and try to exploit that vulnerability. We found over 2,500 unique vulnerabilities identified. I think that just shows the number of 0 days and the number of vulnerabilities there are out there for all the different various technologies. And about 11% of those vulnerabilities have a known exploit. So what that means is there is a POC out there where a threat actor can actually go ahead and run some code and try to exploit that vulnerability and get into their environment. Again, I do want this to be an interactive session. So if you do have any questions while I am presenting my slides, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will try to answer them at the end of the webinar. So I did want to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned before, the importance of patch management. This was an incident that we did where a threat actor was able to exploit a vulnerable FortiGate 0 day, which allowed them to try to execute ransomware. So around December 10th, we saw threat actors actually launching a brute force attack against a target. Again, XDR came in and detected that brute force activity. January 14th, there was a 0 day bug released for FortiGate with an active exploit and an active POC available. So threat actor went in and targeted that FortiGate with that same exploit. They were able to get in. They added some users called Zero. They added a user called super admin, and they added a user called admin to the firewall. Again, they're using common names because it goes under the radar. After that, February 14th. So what I do want to emphasize is just look at the timeline from December 10th to February 14th, about two months that the threat act, 2 to 3 months that the threat actor is trying to get into their environment and eventually gets in. So February 14th, we actually see a suspicious VPN logging in from Sweden and Chicago. And this is not somewhere they log in from. And we were actually able to detect that login and alert them and call them on it. February 16th, attacker tries to edit some policies. They try to remove the API integration with XDR. So they're trying to block the security monitoring that they have in place. They're adding VPNs, they're removing VPNs. So they're essentially removing access to their own environment. And then I think a few hours later, they actually were trying to install PS exec, which is a remote code execution tool, and they were trying to deploy ransomware remotely on 6 servers. Again, managed XDR came in and we detected the PS exec. we detected the ransomware deployment and we quarantined the servers and contained the attack. So it's important to see the two different aspects of what the threat actor was doing and where XDR came in and blocked the attack. And later on in the presentation, I will talk a little bit and show a live demo of managed XDR in play. So we have another poll. Before I get into more statistics about ransomware, I did want to just add, have you or your customers been a target of any sort of ransomware attack?
What are you thinking, Miriam, that people are gonna say?
I think yes, because it is very, I'll show a graph later. It shows the steady ransomware incidents.
So, yeah, that'll be interesting to see. All right, I still see a couple people putting in their answers, so I'll just wait a couple more seconds. Just a reminder, there should be a poll question popping up on your screen right now. We appreciate your answers there. All right, last couple of people entering them in. I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, let's take a look.
Awesome. So as I predicted, about 52% of you guys have been a target or have a customer that was a target, and around 44% are no. But 4% is sure, where they might have been a target and they just don't know it yet. So I think that goes very well into my next slide, which talks about the ransomware incidents, the incidents related to ransomware in 2025. You can see that there's some spikes as well, but it's pretty steady, right? So it's typically ranging around 600 a month, but obviously we'll see maybe towards the end of the year. This is doesn't have December, but towards the holidays, it typically increases because there's more people taking time off, there's less people focused, less resources that are available to do any sort of patch management or password policy changes. So you can see the upticks in some months, but what's important to note is that ransomware is here to stay. And instead of being reactive, we have to take a proactive approach, because I'm going to predict that next year that this number will be even higher. So some of the top ransomware families we actually faced like one-on-one with. We had customers that were targeted by these families, but I do want to emphasize that a lot of these customers that did get targeted, there was some sort of gap. So if you had full XDR deployed within network firewall, EDR cloud, we did not have any incidents for those customers. But there were incidents that maybe they did not have server deployed properly, or they did not have managed EDR across their whole environment. So these customers, unfortunately, there were gaps, and that's how threat actors came in. But again, that was a huge learning lesson. And I think what we try to portray with these reports and these webinars is the importance of making sure you have proper asset management, making sure you have proper monitoring in place. Otherwise, threat actors will take advantage of any gap with your environment. So back to the ransomware families in 2025, Akira was one of them, and some of the tactics that they use is advanced malware. They are very targeted with who they attack. They use double extortion. So what that means is they will actually exfiltrate your data, and not maybe encrypt it, but exfiltrate it and demand ransom. And then will actually encrypt it as well. And they'll threaten to release unless ransomware is paid. Quinn, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but their tactics are very similar as well. Double extortion, exploiting vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned before, like maybe exploiting some sort of firewall, or maybe there's leaked credentials on the dark web that they're able to purchase. They also leverage malware to encrypt data, and they do targeted attacks on critical infrastructure. So sectors such as healthcare, oil, anything that's part of that critical sector environment, and they do go after enterprise organizations as well. And then Cactus, again, a lot of these tactics are similar: double extortion, exploiting vulnerability. They often demand very, very high ransom, so they are more financially motivated compared to Akira or Clint. So, so this slide is also very important. It talks about the speed of ransomware, and we're actually looking at 3 threat actors in here: Akira, Cactus, and Ransom Hub. The first metric we're going to look at is breach to lateral movement. So essentially this means is threat actor got in and they were able to move across your environment. And you can see how it ranges from threat actors, right? So you have Akira doing it in 10 minutes. You have Cactus doing it in 3 days, and then you have Ransom Hub doing it in 2 weeks. So it really depends on how advanced that group is, how many resources that group has, and just the skill set. Also, they could have different motives. Maybe they just want to stay dormant within your environment to get as much data as possible, or they're solely financially motivated. They just want to encrypt everything and ask for ransom. And then lateral movement to encryption, Akira, we saw about 24 hours, and then breach to encryption. This is the full incident. So third actor getting in to encrypting everything. This is Akira, as I mentioned before, 3 hours, and then Ransom Hub over 2 months. And this is really, really important because, as I mentioned before, it varies on the motive of what they're trying to actually achieve. And also if they have the skill set to move faster. A lot of these ransomware groups are using AI and automation, so one may be more advanced than the other. And then breach to data exfiltration, Akira, we saw 1 hour, and then Cactus, we saw about 10 days. So different skill sets and different groups. I know we've been talking about Akira a lot, so this is an example that we did incident response for, where XDR was able to catch Akira ransomware exploiting a ghost account and an unprotected server. So the first action that happens, threat actor leverages compromised credentials for a ghost account. And these compromised credentials can really come from anywhere. They could come from a phishing email, they could be purchased from the dark web. And it was for someone that actually had left the company. And then the threat actor actually targeted a vulnerable VPN without MFA. So they were able to log in with those ghost account credentials through a VPN that did not have MFA. So lead credentials on top of no MFA. And I do want to emphasize that this part of the network was unprotected. So it was not visible to XDR. Once that happened around 1:17 a.m., the threat actor started to move laterally across the network using tools such as InfoStealer and different sorts of password hacking tools. We actually, with XDR endpoint security, we blocked the activity right away. A few minutes later, they try to map devices using advanced IP scanner. They even try to go ahead and disable XDR endpoint security, which we have a feature called anti-tampering, which prevents that from happening. So unsuccessful, they were not able to do it. Again, less than 5 minutes later, they start to prepare data for exfiltration using WinRAR, and they found an unprotected server, so a rogue device within their environment that did not have any sort of monitoring in place, and they actually escalated the privileges. So again, that server unfortunately was not visible to XDR, so we couldn't detect that. And that's essentially how they were able to even attempt to execute the ransomware. So they launched Akira from the unprotected device, And then actually XDR was able to see some of the lateral movement from other devices. So we were able to target the other devices, which essentially led us to that one unprotected device. So all targeted devices were isolated, attack was neutralized. Analysts, we worked on restoring and recovering as soon as possible. We tried to do rollbacks on the targeted endpoints, and we supported the client with investigation and recovery. And we also, again, gave them the feedback that make sure you have endpoint protection across all your environment. So I know a lot of the examples I have been showing have some sort of automated threat response, and this really has saved a lot of time for our customers. And what it is the ability to detect and respond and stop an attack. And we have it divided into three different aspects. So ATR for XDR cloud security, we see an unauthorized login in a 365 environment. We go ahead and disable that account right away within seconds. So threat actor is not able to do any damage. For endpoint security, similar to the examples that I was sharing before, we see an infected endpoint, we block and isolate the device. Threat actor can't move laterally. And then for network security, this is really, really important. This is where we can see like communication to some sort of command and control server or data being exfiltrated. So we see some suspicious communication. We see the IP, and that IP is known to be part of attacks and has a bad reputation. We actually go ahead and block it on the firewall directly, so that communication gets dropped right away. And all of these different aspects do come together. They help the customer streamline the threat response process. So maybe you're getting an alert at 3 a.m. and you don't have anyone available to go ahead to disable an account or block an IP. We're doing it for you. So it does reduce that time to respond, which is really important, because the longer the threat actor is in your environment, the more damage they can do. And then lastly, it is significantly improving your security posture. So I did want to show an example of managed endpoint security in play and show an example of what it's like if you have XDR in place, or if you just have a device in place with only monitoring mode, and how it differentiates. So I'm going to go ahead and play a demo. So we have this account called Acme Inc. We have a device on this called Target Server, and currently it is in a blocking policy. So anything that happens will get blocked right away and remediated. So fully protected device. So now we're going to go ahead onto that device. You see there's a bunch of confidential files that have a bunch of sales data. Just some regular files, Excel files. And then we're going to actually go ahead and try to detonate Lockbit ransomware. So we're going to try to extract all the files and enter the password. And you can see right away that the threat was terminated on the spot. So they were not able to detonate any sort of ransomware on their device, but we were able to detect that malicious file. So in this incident, we would go ahead and still alert the customer because threat actor still was able to get into the environment somehow. So we're going to go back to our customer security dashboard, and you can see right away there was a device that was a device that we detected a new threat, and you could see it was a high alert. And you could, as I mentioned before, it's mapped to MITRE execution. And you can see here it was a target server. We found a high confidence file that was associated with ransomware, gives you all the information, the name of the user that was trying to detonate it, the mitigation status, the classification. And then we also give you the recommendations on what you should do. So now what we're going to do is let's see what happens when we put it in only monitoring. So essentially only monitoring, it doesn't stop anything. It'll just detect it, but it's not going to prevent it's not going to block a process or block a file. So now we'll go ahead and try to detonate that ransomware again. You could see there was a threat detected, but the key point here is it was just detected. It was not blocked. And you could see that the device was actually infected as well with ransomware. Now you were going to actually take a look at the files as well, and you'll see that everything is encrypted. So we're not able to access any of data, and then there's a README file. So you've been hacked with Lockbit, all your important files are stolen and encrypted. This is the ransomware note. Please decrypt and send an email to, they give you an email address, all that information. So can't open any files. So now we're going to go back, and this is actually our SentinelOne portal. And what we'll do is that the fact that they did have XDR, endpoint XDR enabled, it does give them some sort of leeway because we could actually roll back, kill, quarantine, remediate, and roll back. And what this means, it'll actually use a shadow copy and go back to the most clean and healthiest version. So we're going to do that. Take a second. So there you go. This rollback was successful. So again, even if you're just in monitoring mode and you don't have remediation and rollback enabled, it's still, you still have chances of getting back to the safest version. But again, always recommend being in a block policy all the time. Right. So I do want to just close off the presentation with some key recommendations and what you should be doing to protect your environment and protect your customers. So things you can do today to harden and prevent these common attacks is you want to make sure you're implementing some sort of MFA across all your environments. So all your email accounts, all your firewalls, all your VPNs, anything that has a password, make sure you have MFA enabled as well. You want to audit all active accounts. So the examples I showed before, there was an account that was no longer in use. So you want to audit and disable any accounts that's not in use. And then you also want to audit devices and have a very, very strong asset management policy in place because it's usually those rogue devices or those unmonitored devices that become that entry point. You want to leverage some sort of conditional access policy to allow sign-ins only from authorized locations. So if you have businesses in the US and Canada, you want to make sure all your logins are from that location and anything outside is automatically blocked. You're going to always make sure you have a password policy in place and you are constantly rotating credentials every 30 days, every 90 days. Even if a credential gets leaked and is being sold on the dark web, we're going to be hoping it's an older password. And then having a patch management policy in place. So continuously patching your software. So not being reactive, not waiting for a critical vulnerability, not waiting for a 0-day to get released. You want to make sure if there's a new version, you want to patch as soon as possible. And then most importantly, you want to make sure you have some sort of robust security program to prevent these complex threats. And with that, it's to implement full XDR SKU that's across endpoints, servers, networks, appliances, cloud environment, and all email platforms. And I think that goes back to my analogy in the beginning is you want to make sure all your doors within your environment are protected. So I think that is it. I will leave some time for Q&A. So if there's any questions. Okay, there are some questions. I'm gonna go ahead and read them.
Yeah, and just to give you a minute to read through those as well, just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can pop those in now. So I think Miriam's reading through some of them and we'll address them, and we'll do our best to get to those we can. All right, handing it back over to you.
So one of the question is report shows that ransomware attacks reaching encryption to 3 hours, and then some show longer periods. What are the common factors that determine whether organization has minutes versus hours to respond? I think it's the monitoring part. I think a threat actor being in your environment for 3 hours or 2 weeks is irrelevant. You want to detect it as soon as they get into your environment, as soon as they attempt to get into in your environment. So the motive of why they're in your environment varies. Could be financial, could be geopolitical, they could be hacktivists. So it's really varies on why they're in your environment, but monitoring and detecting is what makes the attack a lot less impactful. So one of the questions, since privilege escalations and account manipulation were the top techniques, what early indicators do security teams watch for and get often overlooked? I think going back to my recommendations, having the threat actor blocked at the door. So before privilege escalation happens, before account manipulation happens, they got into the environment, right? So you want to detect it right at the door. So whether if it's some sort of brute force activity that needs to be detected, whether it's exploiting vulnerability, whether it's a leaked credential, you want to stop there before it even gets to the privilege escalation. Because privilege escalations are more complex because if an admin is adding a user or removing a user, it could be normal activity. But if you see an admin automatically just disabling all these users, that would be something to look out for. One of the other questions is, how do you decide when you rely on automated threat response versus a human-led SOC investigation? So automated threat response is usually for the very high confidence alerts that we have. So we don't want to add that extra 10 to 15 minutes for the human in the loop to do investigation. We detect something that's highly malicious based on our machine learning models, based on the threat intelligence that we have. We want to go ahead and block it as soon as possible. So it's reducing that time to detect and that time to respond really makes sure that threat actors are not able to do damage within your environment. Well, I think that those were all the questions.
Miriam, we actually have a couple more if you go into the Q&A section instead of the chat section.
Okay, let's see. Oh, there you go. Are there any APIs for further integrations with other systems? So as I mentioned in the beginning, we integrate with over 40 different technologies. So depending on the technology, you can either integrate with an API or an agent. But the goal of our whole mission is to be an open extended response platform. So we want to be able to support as many technologies as we can. So Nick, you could let me know which system you're looking for, and I can let you know if that's something we support or not. There was another question for privilege escalation. Did the account that was compromised and used to create the super admin account already an admin account itself? Yes, it was. So that's that's why it's really important to have those password policies in place, even for your admin accounts as well. Because if a password gets leaked and they're in your environment, and in this specific case, they didn't have MFA enabled. So if they had MFA enabled, could have been stopped, but there were, two whammies here and the threat actor was able to get in. So they created a super admin account that had privileges across the whole network. All right, awesome. Well, I thank everyone for attending the webinar, and I hope this was helpful. And I definitely encourage everyone, if you haven't already, is to download the report and read through it. And it has a lot of very, very insightful information and data that could be useful for your organization.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Miriam, for taking us through all that great information. For those of you still looking to read through the report, just a reminder that it's in the resources and will be sent to you via email after the session with the recording. If we weren't able to get to your question or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. We'll be in touch. But thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us here today. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.